Mainly, I just want to invite us all to be really to take a moment to look around the space we're in each of the places we are, because we're here together, and this medium, it can sometimes be a strange there can be a pulling out of body that can happen through the screen. And I know that we've all been practicing ways of being embodied in this online connection, because we are. But let's just take a moment to kind of look around the space we're in, and also give ourselves permission to keep doing that as much as we want to do while we're on screen, so we're not locked into this kind of screen visual labor. Thanks,
Lori.
That's all I wanted to start with.
Thank you very much.
Well, maybe I'll just jump into, and because we can still let people in as people arrive, but it's almost, well, it's 5 after. So, and just also kind of keeping with that thought, I thought it's also maybe a nice moment to think about the Indigenous land that everybody is on across the country. Neighborhood Dance Works is in St. John's, Newfoundland, like many of you know, and this is the traditional land of the Mi'kmaq people. And I just thought it would be a nice moment for everybody just in your own quiet space to think about the connection that you have to your land and consider the Indigenous peoples that originally inhabited the land that you're on. Thank you all for being here today. I'm Calla, and this is Lois. And I work at Neighborhood Dance Works. So, and there's a lot of people here who I know, and there's a few faces that I don't know. So it's really nice to see Kathy Ferry coming into the room. Oh, wow. This is great. I love this. So I'm not going to talk for long because you're really here to listen to some other wonderful artists speak today in this facilitated conversation with Lois. I want to thank Lori Clark and Lois for being the curators and facilitators of Performative Inquiry Group, which is a space for dialogue and discourse, sharing, learning, thinking, building ideas with one another so that we can be closer to our artistic practices and the ways that we work in and outside of the studio and in our lives. So I'm just very grateful for the work that they've put into building this performance series, performative inquiry series. Well, thank you. And thank you for Ted and Candice and Louise and Ruairí for being here to be part of the first conversation. And stay tuned. Please follow us because Lori's going to be leading the next session coming up in the new year with an emerging artist, Erwin Churchill. So we're really looking forward to that as well. And I'm just going to hand it right on over to Lois.
Okay, thank you, Calla. There was I think a tiny bit of housekeeping to do, Robin, and then I'll do my way of setting this up and introducing and what we're doing today.
Sure. Hi, I'm Robin. I'm also in Newfoundland, but I'm in Sunnyside, just a couple hours from St. John's. I'm going to be supporting sort of the Zoom side of things. So if anybody has questions or concerns, you can send me a little private message in the chat, and I'll keep track of like mics off and cats in the background, things like that. So I'll be floating around the screen a little bit. It's nice to be able to see everyone's faces. Thanks for having me. I'll pass it back to Lois. I'm
going to do a little bit of my why I sort of, I guess I'm put this panel together the way that I did. And really some of the panelists were actually involved in me putting it together. And by kind of introducing them more like as friends, I guess, than as colleague friends more than anything else. And through my introduction, I'm hoping that I weave kind of some of the things that I've been pondering around the idea of contemporary art in a ruralist or a rural setting, or I think I also called it archipelagic thinking and the kitchen table. I think there's been like about 10 different titles for this panel, and I never really picked one. So you'll notice that that reflects the way I weave this introduction to the topics and also to the people who are at my table today. So we're going to try and stop, although we're a little behind schedule already. That's normal. It's crypt time. So we're going to try and stop at 5 to the hour in Newfoundland, where it is now 2:09. And I'm sitting in an office in Duckworth Street. And then we'll have hopefully around 20 minutes. So if at any time a question or a comment comes up for you, just put it in the chat. And after we stop, we'll look to these comments or questions, and Robin will pick out something and voice it to you. So to the panelists, and then we can also turn. So I'm going to ask you to turn your video and mute yourselves off until that time. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to tell you, sometimes you might notice a little me pausing overly long or saying the wrong word. Just please replace it for me on my behalf with the right word. I have chronic pain. It's a little bit out of control today. So I'm a seventh generation Newfoundlander, and I've spent most of my career on the island. And the island of Newfoundland is part of the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. And that's, of course, in Canada. So because I was mostly on the island, and although I did my undergrad in Edmonton, I wasn't really a conscious person at like 17 to 20 in retrospect. And so I didn't really think of being away from home at that time. So it wasn't until I was in my late 40s and spent a period of time in Montreal that I thought of, that I came to consider myself somewhat isolated. Prior to that, there'd been things that I now look back on and see as experiences of isolation, but I recall that sometimes a colleague would say, "Do you feel isolated when you're in Newfoundland?" And I would respond, "Not till now." I mean, the island was my whole experience, and we were in the midst of a renaissance in terms of Newfoundland art, and so I didn't really see beyond that. But I do recall that in around 1984, a trio was made by two of my mentors, Kathy Ferry and Diane Moore of Live Art in Halifax, and Kathy, founder of Neighborhood Dance Works. And they and the other member of the trio was Lee Saunders, who is Louise Moyes' mentor, who's going to be speaking as well. And it was called Bogak, If We Were Any Good, We Wouldn't Be Here, a long song and dance. And so I want to just acknowledge that that's perhaps where this panel today began. I had to phone Louise today and say, just remind me of what Bogak actually meant, even though I knew the piece was also around the theme of bogs. And maybe I should have phoned Ruairí, because it's actually an old Irish word meaning bog or quagmire. And that's kind of where I think we found ourselves then, in terms of being in rural areas or remote areas, or even in the regions. And I began to sort of articulate lately what I was experiencing then, which was like an experience of neglect, a lack of being seen, and something happened because of that. I know I've talked to Ted sometimes about work that he did with a company in Winnipeg, correct? Yes. And so sometimes when, okay, I don't know what's going on. Okay. Sometimes when we're together and we talk about those early days, we talk about how sometimes we would do something, me in Newfoundland, or he would do something there with his company there, very significant company. And 2 years later, someone in New York would do it, or somebody in Toronto would do it. And we would have colleagues come to us and say, oh, you know, this guy just did this dance where he's suspended in the air and he did it with a strobe light. And I'd be like, yeah, I did that like a couple of years ago here in St. John's. Or Ted would be like, yeah, we did that 5 years ago in Winnipeg. And out of that came, you know, because they would be like, whatever, the guy in New York, the guy in Toronto. And out of that came this kind of sense that we were somehow different. No matter, even if we did something exactly like someone in New York, we were still different. And we had a different sense of what originality was. We had a different sense of what it meant to author something, of what it meant to value something, and of what it was to have a voice, because we had a different voice. And sometimes our voice could not be heard. We could hear it. And so I'm really interested in the way that we were shaped by our invisibility, and also the way some of our artists have worked to make the invisible visible. And I'm thinking Louise, of Louise here, who formed a whole genre called docu-dance in order to make many of the invisible voices in the Port-au-Port Peninsula and other places, and she'll talk about it later, visible to us in her pieces. And lately it's gone beyond just making a family or a person visible, and she's making her neighborhood, which has many stratas of people there. Some of them are very invisible and we don't know about them until they die, and which has happened in the last year or so. And how during the pandemic and before that, the blizzard, she took her commitment to justice in her own neighborhood into a social justice advocacy and concern for people who needed things in her neighborhood and didn't have them. And I also think about what I've learned from working with Candice Pike, who works in Corner Brook and works with a community practice. And so she might be putting together a little choreography that's going to occur inside of a community production of the Nutcracker, but she also will be at another time deconstructing burlesque movement with a colleague of hers, and then creating like these incredibly open community practices. She moves seamlessly from teaching toddlers to creating really different and innovative work. And it's all accelerated my understanding of Alison Kafer's Crypt Time. It's gone far to making me understand what Carmen Papalia is talking about when he talks about the disability arts principles of open access. And so now I'm weaving my way to Ruairí Ó'Donnabháin. And I just got to know him just a couple of years ago, but it seems like I know you forever. And you came to stay with me, but I didn't know who you were at all. And that worked out really well. And you invited me, Ruairí invited me to a piece that was called Archipelagic Thinking. And there's two parts of that. I started to realize through him, I guess I'd realized it, but I started to articulate it, the fact that some of us are in isolation in our arts practice. And when we realize that, we slowly get our brains opened, or we're lucky enough to meet Ruairí by chance. And we realize that there are other artists who are also working in isolation, and that we can draw this, network, or this, we can step the little stones across the archipelago to meet this other artist. I mean, with Ted, we're very lucky because we consider him a Newfoundlander. He comes here so much. So we're just really indebted to his work, because we not only get to see it, we also get him to be in our community and talk to him. So in order to get to this, so this is the other thing that I learned by going to see Archipelagic Thinking on Cape Clare. I had to get from, I had at that time been to Europe, I think twice before, only. And I'm older and I have chronic pain, and I had to get from Cork to this little island. And all of my friends were coming, but then suddenly no one was coming. And then I said, I have a ticket, but I have no money for food. And he's like, you can stay with me and all my friends, and we'll give you at least one meal a day, and you can have a bedroom to yourself. And I said, yeah, but I don't know how to get there. Like, I have the air ticket, but I'm already lost and I haven't even left home. So he said that he would help me get there. So I got to Cork and I called him. And so then I got on a bus. Then I got the bus to Skibbereen, and I called him and I said, Ruairí, all of the buses in Ireland have the same number. They're all like bus 129. So I don't know how to change buses. And he's like, okay, well, you need to stand on this side of the street. Don't worry about it. I'll be here. And then I got the bus and I ended up in Baltimore. And of course I could see that there was a ferry. So I went towards it. And I had also said to her, what if you don't come to get me? What's the address? And he's like, you don't need to know the address. Just, I will be there. And I'm like, but you could break down or something, and not like, what if you're not there? Anyway, this went back and forth, same thing for quite a while. And he said, okay, the address is Siobhan Cody's house. And as a Newfoundlander, as somebody also who's familiar with living in small places, that made perfect sense to me, because as a Newfoundlander, we often are invited to go to an address that's called the house beside where Lukey White's house used to be. So I knew I was kind of home, even I traveled all this way. And so that brings me to, that's just my story example of the kind of care. And Ruairí's done a lot of work with something that he calls aftercare, but there was a lot of before care as well. And it also ended up with me never knowing where the piece began and where the piece ended, which is also, I think, a part of practicing in like rural areas. And so I think I was going to say something else, but I'm actually just going to stop there. And now I'm going to ask some questions. And I'm going to start with you, Candice. And I want you to talk a little bit about what words you use when you talk about your ruralist art practice.
Yeah, okay, so hi, I'm joining from Corner Brook.
Can you say what, yes, okay, thank you. You're in the same time zone.
I'm in the same time zone in Newfoundland, in Corner Brook. In the Bash's old house, like where they used to live before that someone else fixed it up. So that's how you know how to find me. It's like just kind of across from Fox's, if you know where Fox's is. And yeah, so I never knew that I needed a word or a language until Lois told me that I did, or was encouraging me to like describe the practice. Actually, I don't think she was. I think she was telling me what it was called. And I don't remember what the words were, but now you're saying ruralist. So I feel like, yeah, I actually do have a rural practice. And I struggle with that as an identity because I lived, the first few years of my life in the metropolis of St. John's, knowing that St. John's is the city and everywhere else is the bay, which makes it rural. And then when I moved out of St. John's, I moved to the bay, but there was I moved inland, so there was no bay or water. And I did a whole bunch of rural living, not by the bay, so I didn't feel like a real Newfoundlander. I live by the ocean. It's right there. In a house with a shed with a wood stove in it, and all my neighbors have parked cars on their lawn, like that are just, I don't really know what the cars are for, but they multiply, like they reproduce, and they decay. So I feel like I do live in a rural area. That's what I call rural. I made another comment to Ted that a rural area is like when you know the woman at the store's name and she can snare a rabbit. But then I was like, my situation is actually about the wood stove in the shed. And so this is where I make most of the work. A lot of time, like in this house or in the garden or in the shed, or on the path. It's an old railway track that runs in front of my house. And because of that, now I call it rural practice. And I call it rural aesthetics because the images and ideas are the ones that I see and feel around me. So if I'm like, my body is responding to that, or my thoughts are responding to that. And so I call it rural practice. Sometimes I don't do dance. Sometimes I'm doing administration or just ways of connecting people within the community, as an arts educator, or like running like audience engagement programs or whatever. And I call that community networking choreography because it's still dealing with people in space, and connecting, and systems and patterns and sharing of information through space. So I still imagine that as choreography. And so sometimes I call that community networking choreography. Maybe that's all I say.
Yeah, okay, well, we're going to come back to you. So those are great. That's great. And we're going to just let all the kitchen tablists, I'm constantly making up words and just putting IST at the end of words or something. We're just like going to let what each person says, talking stick style, I also call it AA style or 12-step program style, collide with each other. I think it's almost the best option on Zoom. So Ruairí, I'm going to go to you next, and I'm going to ask you also to tell me a little bit about the words you just used to describe your practice. And maybe you could also perhaps talk to us a little bit about residencies on Cape Clare.
Gur mágad Lois. Is mi sé Ruairí Ó'Donnabháin, tá me cur Ilan Clara Fooms and I'm sure. Hello everyone, I'm Ruairí Ó'Donnabháin and I'm zooming in from Cape Clear Island, which is a small island about an hour and a bit off the southwest coast of Ireland. So we're the most southwesterly inhabited part of Europe. So I'm the last stop before all y'all over there across the pond on the other island. I've been like jotting down notes. It's just like there's so much to think through, and I'm very comforted by the kitchen table metaphor. So
Ruairí, can you also tell us what time it is there?
Yeah, it's now 5 to 6 p.m. So, and there's a big storm rolling in, and the Christmas lights are cable tied down to the outside of the house. Yeah, it's interesting to start the call, and it's always been a privilege in Newfoundland and also in Canada, when I've been very lucky to spend time in your part of the world, to begin every event thinking about indigeneity and about place and homemaking. And these questions for us are as complicated, but in a very different way in the Irish perspective, dealing with our colonial history and also our complicated history as settlers out in the world. So it's always really beautiful to connect with this group and this way of working and thinking, because it's not a practice that is widely dispersed. Yeah, some words that I use to think about and that really identify my practice. In Irish, we have a thing called mehel. So here on the island, if you want to do something, if you, hello, someone's saying hi. If you want to get something done, like if I need to build a wall, or if something gets damaged in the storm, we have an island WhatsApp group and we have a mehel. And basically what that means is, it's a really nice old Irish word for free labor, where your neighbors will come and build a wall with you, and everyone will. So there's kind of intergenerational also. Wall building is really important here because it's so specific to the like 5 square miles. Here within the 5 square mile island, there's already like many different wall building practices. So I like starting with wall building. And it takes a village, I guess, is the kind of like the nugget from the mehel, and the work that's made here in terms of speaking to funders or festival programmers or arts administration and infrastructure. My work can be described as socially engaged, or it can be dismissed as community work. So I like to, although it is doing lots of those things, and I do believe in those forms, I like to try and think it through the Irish concept of mehel instead. So I don't feel labored by this idea of me as a kind of parachuting in. We say law das, like a fair weather artist or a fair weather islander. Another thing that I jotted down to think about is, in Irish, we say ceantar is the area around you. So the physical world that we live in and that we see in. And before I moved here to the island, I was based in Berlin, and moving here to the island was a big shock and a big acclimatization. But the ceantar here, I think people are living and working on the island in rural settings, in the margins, on the peripheries here in Ireland, on the cusp of Europe and the Atlantic, in really radical and queer ways that they might not describe as radical or queer, but are inherently so because of their connection to the place or to history or to female knowledge forms passed down intergenerationally. So these things are like really present for me. But in Irish, we also have the altar. So this is kind of something I'm grappling with lately, is the altar is the other world. And there's a little children's rhyme in Irish that says, Tá tua de danan ar cualan tí. So the other world is at the bottom of the garden. So we live with this kind of presence of the mystical, the magical, the embodied, the other. It's built into the landscape. It's encoded in the bodies. It's encoded in the work forms and the practices. So I'm kind of grappling now, trying to read people like Karen Barad and other theoreticians, and thinking about quantum science and everything we're learning, and also the autonomy and agency of this virus that we're dealing with, and other viruses that we've been dealing longer with, become very, like, can come into focus in the rural place, in this meeting of the ceantar and the altars, so between the physical and the other world. What else did I want to say? You asked me about residency. I can do a pitch. So I moved to the island and I was working here living alone, setting myself up and being welcomed into the community and weaved into the community here. And I did that for 2 years, and then I saw that there was all this empty, there's a lot of dereliction on the island, there's a lot of holiday homes, there's a lot of empty spaces. There's a beautiful old pub here that they house Irish students, so it's like high school students come in the summer and they stay in this big old house. So I kind of poured the poison in the ear of the local committee here and said, hey, like this house is empty for the winter. Wouldn't it be great if we were able to set up a residency program here on the island? So we run this residency program. It's an Irish language immersion program. I suppose it's the other really important thing about this island is it's an Irish language speaking community with a protected status. But a lot of the resources traditionally for Irish language arts practice go towards fluent speakers or to traditional arts, and it can kind of be seen as a bit old-fashioned or romantic or twee. So I was really interested in the kind of radical contemporary stuff that was happening, and that is happening also in this frame of rural work, because what happened here with the language was it kind of got pushed out of Dublin and west to the periphery of the island. So along the west coast and the islands, the Irish language speaking areas kind of established or remained. And now we're trying to push back with this contemporary practice back. So this, what you spoke about, isolation, I understand through the kind of lens of, I don't say like periphery or marginal anymore, because I think actually we're linked into this kind of Atlantic archipelago that I understood. I came here like thinking I was going to live on this island and the island would be the research. And the minute I arrived, I understood like in a very powerful way that the island it's like dispersed or refracted across the North Atlantic through its histories and the migration of animals and resources and exchange of ideas and practices. So yeah, that's probably enough for me for now, but those are some words I'm thinking about. Yeah, thanks, Lois.
Thank you very much. Thanks. This is, I think this specific panel first came to mind when you came to Corner Brook to work in a shed in Candice's and David's shed with me and Candice. And I love to hear you and Candice talk about these things. So Ted, I'm going to ask you to speak next. And I know when we did a little bit of emailing back and forth with all of you that you said that you didn't think of your practice as particularly ruralist. And then you made the comment, I just need solitude to make my work. And that, when I put my introduction together, the one I gave today, which maybe was a little bit better when I was practicing it, but there you go. That's live performance for you. It struck me that solitude is maybe the positive end of isolation for me. So I just want to thank you for that. And now I want you to tell the story that I say your sensei suggested that you buy the farm. This is all lies. So can you jump off from what I'm trying to say here and tell that story about your work? And maybe as you roll out the story for us today, you could also talk about residencies.
Thanks. Thanks for the introduction. And also to mention the fact that I started my work I started choreographing in Winnipeg 40 years ago. And at the time, it wasn't just the sort of isolation of Winnipeg, but the isolation of my work, because it was very, very different from what was going on in Winnipeg. And just through some kind of luck, people liked it, because unfortunately, I thought I was making very serious work and they all laughed at it, but it allowed it to, progress. And then I ended up spending 11 years there, and I through fate, ended up taking over a company, and that gave me some substantial, people believed in my work, and then I was able to go independent and get grants. I went back to Ottawa, where I had grown up, which I never thought I would do, and studied at Le Groupe, and I studied with Peter, Le Groupe Dance Lab. So I started to get interested in helping people make work. Little did I know that you can't help people to make work. You can just sit there and watch them and acknowledge them and all this kind of thing. But I learned that eventually. But then during the 90s, I joined a monastery. I became a monk. I started studying Zen as a monk, and I studied there and lived there for 6 years, and also made my work. So there was another kind of isolation in the monastery, another difference, because I wasn't really supposed to go out and associate with friends. I could go to work, I could go and perform, I could go and do workshops, run labs and things like that. But I couldn't really go out and party and drink and stuff like that. But at times I did. Then I left there in 2000 and was lucky enough to inherit a bit of money. So I bought a beautiful condo in downtown Ottawa, and I bought a BMW and had it furnished my condo with everything that a monk should not have. But I left the monastery and I lived with my mother for 5 months, made sure she was okay, and then I went off on my own. After 4 years, and I was at that time making solos, I toured them internationally, nationally, blah, blah, blah. After 3 years, really, I started to get dissatisfied because I went, well, everything that I thought I wanted doesn't make me happy. It doesn't do me any good. And I thought there's got to be something else. So I went off. I sold the condo after 4 years. I went off to Europe for 5 months. I was actually commissioned to make, we collaborated our companies, working with Louise Moyes. So there was a lot of sort of working with that somebody who is that well known, and I'm not that well known, made me sort of, I kept saying, if only you weren't so famous, Louise, that we'd have a good time. Anyways, we made a piece, it toured, I went to the Venice Biennale, you know, all this kind of stuff. And during that time I went, I don't know, I just want to make a solo. I just want to go back to making a solo for myself. Enough with all of this touring and glamour, quote. And I went back to Montreal, where I was renting a 2-room apartment, and I said, okay, I'm gonna buy something I can make a solo in, because that's what I want to do, is live and work in the same place. I looked at 2 lofts in Montreal. I looked at a place in the Byward Market in Ottawa where I had my condo, and I thought that was the place I was going to be. I thought downtown Ottawa, it's not like Montreal, it's not like Vienna, it's not like Prague, it's smaller. And then, but then I went to look out at a farm, a 94-acre farm on a lake. And I was driving up the laneway and I went, this is it. And as somebody said, what did he choose? It'll probably be the most impractical thing. So yes, it was. It was the most impractical thing. It had a beautiful little stone house, a piggery that had a wood stove and and a barn. I made a floor in the barn the first summer so I could rehearse there. I made a solo, and then Margie Gillis came to visit, and she said, well, we're going to have a show. And I said, but it's only for rehearsal. And it was just like a ragged barn with a platform floor in it. And she said, no, we're going to have a show. So we made a poster, and we had people. We had 25. We could I only had 25 chairs in the house, lawn chairs, and people brought their own and everything else. So 25 people came. People came on ATVs, and the rougher men who weren't interested in this, who brought their lady friends, and they were sipping beer. By the end of the show, they were at the door because Margie was so entrancing. and I guess myself as well. So that started this idea of a public was interested, not only locally, but people drove from Ottawa. And people were crying because this one lady said, I've only seen Margie at Place des Arts, and there she was, like 5 feet away from me. So, and she was like weeping. I'm going, oh no. So anyway, I started, for 7 years, I lived at the farm. We had shows there for the local public, but also people would drive from Ottawa to see shows. And I would make 1 or 2 shows a year. I tried to have live music all the time. At first, I thought I should make more accessible work. Is accessible? So I made things like in cowboy boots and plaid shirts and jeans and guitars. So we did that, but it still was a bit weird. It wasn't totally sane. Then I went more and more into the realm where my mind really works. And there's one thing I want to say, it's to do with land acknowledgement and everything else, but the first summer I was there, I was on the porch and sitting on my porch, I used to smoke then, having a smoke and a drink. And it was just about dusk. And I heard what sounded like a human cry from behind me in the forest, because it was 94 acres of forest all around me. And then I heard it happened again, and it happened again. And by the 3rd time, I immediately knew that I did not own this land. This was not my land. And that how can you own land? It's just there for you to try and take care of and inhabit and use to the kindest way possible for people to enjoy it. So anyways, that was just a little thing that that also happened to me being alone on the land. So anyways, I would bring people in for residencies at the farm, and they enjoyed it tremendously because I ended up having to buy a cottage on the lake, and they would stay there. And it was quite expensive for single people to come for residencies because I made them rent the cottage for $700 a week. Sorry, but anyway, I had to pay for it somehow. But we would eat together, we would discuss things together, and we'd have evenings out on the porch and this kind of thing. They could go swimming, and they worked every day in the barn. When I moved from there, the other thing I want to say about living in the country is that it happened I admitted this in my last, I want to make sure I don't go over here, my last performance in Halifax of my solo that I made in the country. Somebody asked me my question, well, what's it like to live in the country? What are the people like and everything? And I actually said, I almost teared up because I said it's the first time that I can remember that people like me for me and not for what I do, because they don't know what I do and they still like me. And that gave me a certain kind of confidence of like, wow, there must be something here besides what I do, because I identify so heavily that, oh, it's just what I do, right? That's all. So that was another thing that the country taught me, was this idea of there's time enough that you get to know people in a different way. It's just in the studio. So then I ended up buying another place and another place and another place. Now I'm in a schoolhouse, an old schoolhouse built in 1937 with 2 rooms. And then there's a basement, and I put a bathroom downstairs for people and a sauna. And so the kitchen is the studio. It's big enough for 1 or 2 people to do research in only. And so no more shows, but just research. But it's a nice place to do that in.
Yeah, thank you. I asked you if you would tell me what to ask you. And one of the things that you said was, what choices am I in control of, and what choices seem to arrive because of fate, whim, other people, limitations, changes of weather, or choices that are not choices, but just situations just beyond your control. And I think you answered that question by telling us the story just now. So that's
I really just sort of follow something that I'm not quite sure I'm aware of.
yeah.
And it's
yeah,
something that we were talking about living in not knowing.
yeah.
It's a Zen thing, and how I think that's what I've done all my life. And I've been really, really lucky and privileged to be able to live in my own mind, and lucky to be able to express some of that stuff out on the stage, and people actually then like it.
Yeah.
Some people don't like it, believe me.
And I love the theme of which you articulated, and so did Candice and Ruairí, in this kind of work, people are closer. They're closer to the performers, literally, physically, I mean by literally, physically. And also the idea that when that happens, power changes. And I love that too. And thanks for acknowledging also that when we do a land acknowledgement, the land contains sounds and many other things besides just real estate, which is, we tend to think about real estate without wanting to. So now I'm going to, thank you very much. Now I'm going to move on to ask Louise a question. So Louise, I really felt like, I know DocuDance isn't a ruralist practice per se, and you're living in what Candice called, you know, the busy urban hub of St. John's. But as I said in my introduction, you have really devoted a lot of your life to your work, to making these invisible stories visible. And I know from, well, I don't even remember when I met you, because I don't know if we met or if we just always knew each other. I think we just always knew each other. And the kinds of things that, when I look now at your, you know, as you get older, there's like a, you have a story of practice as well. And when I look at that, I'm just, I see more and more things that connect your work to some of the things that we're talking about today. So I want to ask you a little bit about how your art practice, and I know you have a rural connection as well, but how your art practice is moving forward. So if you could just tell us maybe briefly about overall your practice, but then tell us about like what's happening to the practice now since the snowmageddon blizzardy thing that we suffered through, which we didn't know there was going to be a pandemic hooked onto the end of that.
Great. Yes, and the show that poster is in our hall downstairs. When I met my partner, who has lived in our house for 40 years in St. John's, we went upstairs. The top floor nothing had been done much, and it was kind of like, oh, kind of, you know, lots of shadows and old wallpaper still falling off. It hadn't been fixed up at all. What's that poster? He said, oh, it's some old dance poster. I was like, some old dance poster. That's my legacy up there. My matriarchs, you know, when we got to look at it, it was so fun. And then we kind of cleaned it up, and now it's in pride of place in the front hall. So you and Lee Saunders and Joe Leslie, who brought me to Montreal. So I came to dance a bit late, and it's through Neighborhood Dance Works that I got into dance. Luckily, they would bring Lois and Ann Anderson and Ann Troke would bring people here to do workshops. So I did a 6-week workshop. And then Joe Leslie was starting the studio in Montreal. So that was 1988, 89, Studio 303. I was the first girl on the desk taking in the money. And I stayed there for a long time, but I lived between two places. I lived between Montreal and St. John's, and I went back and forth, 3 months here, 6 months there for 15 years. I said I was a nomad between two places. And in 2001, I did a show where I started in Montreal, and I went by train and boat. I took the longest route I could home through the south shore of Quebec, and then up to the lower North Shore, where you can only get to by boat or helicopter. Harrington Harbor, where they talk like Newfoundlanders and watch NTV, but it's part of Quebec. And then next was Tête à la Baleine. I'm bilingual, so I was, but the people, but Tête à la Baleine, it was Halloween. So I thought the best way to get to know people in this community of 150 people was to go out. I dressed up like a clown with one of the kids, and I went door to door for Halloween. And the next morning, the woman who I was staying with, she spoke English and her husband spoke French. And she said to her grandson, "Oh, stop eating that all junk. Nanny wants you to eat something better than that all junk." And the grandson replied, "No, arrêtez, je veux pas grand-mère." This was the place where my Newfoundland and my Quebec lives met, in Tête à la Baleine. Anyway, so then I made my way the west coast of Newfoundland, south coast, where you can only go by boat or helicopter to, back to St. John's. And I made a show where I interviewed 20 people. I played 20 different people. And unlike Lois, I like getting lost. I like just going, no plan. Whoever takes me in, really just here I am, who takes people in, and then start talking to them for whatever reason. But that show, it was like I was building the connections between my Montreal and my St. John's lives. And it was like my archipelago, it was making connections. And then I had my two halves connected, and I realized, oh, I have to go back to Newfoundland. That's the main place where I create from. And I have cobbled together enough skills to survive here financially. And then I made a show where I just played one person. And that was on the Port-au-Port. And I just want to say that the Port-au-Port is the French Newfoundland. And there's really right now only about 500 French speakers left who are still speaking French. It was beaten out of them. They were the worst, treated as badly as any Acadians. There was a lot of prejudices from all sides and from the Americans at the base in the 1940s on the West Coast. But I love doing interview and creating in rural areas. I get a lot from that. It reminds me of talking to my grandmothers. But going back and performing in those places is just so fun. Performing Florence's story in her community, they were laughing at the sad parts and crying at the funny parts, and every inch of land that I spoke about. And you don't realize how much, if you're interviewing someone about their lives, place is so important. They knew exactly what I was talking about. They knew they'd seen the boat where they were throwing the flour overboard to make the boat lighter so it could take off, and they knew that the captain actually put the boat ashore on purpose before I said it, so he could feed his community for the winter, it was like performing in front of them. There was 70 people in a place that fit about 70 people. I say, I'll never have a performance like that again. It was like a current running through, because they knew all the references, but then, it did stand up. You try to make the universal too. And I got to perform outside as well, which was great. But yes, I live in St. John's. When I moved back here in 2003, people in Montreal say, "Well, why do you want to go back there? There's nothing there." I say, have you been? Do you know? And people who would say that hadn't been here. But so then I actually, the last 10 years, I've been working with other people a lot, working in collaboration, and that has been amazing. And then lately it's been time to come back to my solo work. I thought so. And so I live in a neighborhood that's been in crisis the past 7 or 8 years for different reasons, street-based sex work, and a lot of the drug use and violence moved just a couple streets from a couple streets down below us to right in the middle of our neighborhood. And at the same time, I was feeling my own kind of disconnection. I too was getting into the Netflix and kind of in my own domain, my house that I own, Ted, like feeling like, and it was not feeling comfortable. and I wasn't sure I wanted to stay in my neighborhood, but my partner wasn't leaving. He's been here 40 years. So you know, as artists, often we're lucky because we have an itch, we get to scratch it. So I just said, I want to sit with this, what is happening in my own life and my neighborhood, and work on it. And luckily was able to do that with time. And I would say that so we made a show about a walking tour about our neighborhood that takes about an hour and a half, and you start outside our house and you come through the house, and my partner Mark, he's been recruited, he performs, he
And
is
Louise, before that, you'd actually made a piece about the Daly family, and it was happened to be in your neighborhood as well, right?
that's right,
So
yes,
then that led to the walk.
a piece about more a bigger piece about the neighborhood, a family that lived a few doors up, our friend Diana's family, and they were from St. Mary's, also a small place about an hour and a half south of St. John's. And Diana's grandmother had 12 children, and 6 were in the family lower, very, very tall, and 6 were persons of short stature, what some people call little people, and they all lived with disabilities, and were all incredibly included. They were inclusion, the family were really inclusive before, you know, they were just naturally inclusive, and everybody was given jobs, and everybody was equal. So in that work, got to work a lot with the head of the Coalition of Disabilities here, and Kim White, and that work, learning about disability practice, disability thought, really has informed the work I'm doing now too, about inclusions, taking a step back and being inclusive. So
and Kim was in the walk then as well.
within the walk too. So then she got invited to be a performer. That's right. She got invited to be a performer, and talked about how uninclusive and unaccessible this neighborhood is, because it's really steep hills all around, all around. But then, yeah. So the walk, we did it one year. We did it in 2018. Then 2019, we didn't do it for different reasons, and I was really glad we didn't. But you know, when a new season comes round, and you feel that in your body and all your senses what it was like the year before. And I have to say, making the piece the following summer, remembering the making of the piece, I felt like it was like almost like one of those weighted blankets people sleep with, or a warm embrace, or I just was feeling more and more grounded in my house, in my neighborhood, in myself, I guess. You know, it gave me a lot. And so then when, before the pandemic, here in Newfoundland, for those of you who don't know, in January, we had a snowstorm that gave us 95 centimeters of snow and gale force winds at the same time. So it was like the biggest snowstorm we'd had in 50 years, and a hurricane at the same time. It was really frightening to be in. And then the snow was so high, everything was shut down. Grocery stores were shut for 5 days. You could not leave your property. It was a state of emergency that lasted for a full week. And then people, if they didn't have access to money, even if the grocery store was open. And because we knew our neighborhood, we started thinking, oh, what about such and such? I wonder how they're doing. And a neighbor and I started knocking on doors, and then it just kind of built from there. And then we found people were doing the same thing in other neighborhoods, trying to find out how people were and if they had enough to eat. And we found lots of people who didn't, and lots of people who were in withdrawal too. So where do I go from that, Lois? I'm not sure.
No, that's, yeah, I mean, I think that is a good, it's good for us to stop there, because I like to leave on this awkward realization, because that is where we're at. So I think it's good to not to put a conclusion on that, Louise. So thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to check in and say time's not really going the way that I planned. And I would like to ask Candice one little sub question because she started out first. And then maybe we'll go to Robin and see if there's some question that has come up in the chat. And I want to just let you know now that Ted and Ruairí and Louise and Candice actually answered my questions in writing, more questions than I've been able to fit in today. And we're going to publish, or as the Canada Council used to say, disseminate by putting it somehow on the PIG site, aren't we, Kala?
Yes, we will.
Well, so if there was something of particular interest, there's lots more got said in writing than we've been able to voice today. So Candice, I'm just before we go to our other people that are here with us, I wonder if you would just briefly describe your audience in residence project, which Ruairí participated in. So, yeah.
Oh yeah, such a lovely connection. So yeah, and let the conversation continue, because I am really passionate in talking about art happening in rural places and the ways that it does. And one thing that makes my blood boil a little bit is this idea that the reason that people maybe in small towns don't go out to live art or dance performances don't get programmed here anymore, and blah blah blah, new music and all that stuff, is because somehow we need to educate the audience, like that they need to know something special in order to like get the work. Like I know I'm in the company of friends here, so I can be kind of critical of that work. And I'm thinking, I don't know that it's that people don't know about the work and that they're ignorant rural people. They're like more smart than any, like you just have to show up. So the whole point is you have to show up. And so for a while I had this idea that what if you just needed like some care and support to show up and to feel connected to the work. So I had this idea that I wanted to do not an artist in residence, but an audience, so that there would be a group of people who could express interest in that. And then, we'd pick a bunch of professional shows. Yeah, and I wanted to pick professional shows just because of the community that I'm in, and that there's already a lot of enthusiasm for, the like Grease remount from the high school and that kind of stuff.
So you wanted to pick something other than that?
Yeah.
For sure.
And how it ended up working out, the Arts and Culture Center supported me to actually, after a few years of me thinking about it, develop this program. They were looking for ways to connect with some like public sector employees, and that was like a priority of theirs. So I was allowed to have a call and get 10 public servants from anyone who, if you like swept the floors at a government building or were a senior manager, you could do it. And we had 10 people that basically like they just agreed to see 10 shows that then I curated that with the Arts and Culture Center and what they were actually bringing. And then before or after each show or at lunchtime that day, they'd have a moment to find a way to connect with the show. So one thing was, one of the shows had really complicated blocking where people were at different levels and power dynamics and stuff. So we just had a conversation before the show with food, always with food, at every event. And that really opened people up so much, where they had conversations with each other, sitting and standing at different levels. And then they saw the show after having already embodied that idea and not being told like, this shows power difference, but they just did it beforehand, and then they were ready to experience it. Or we saw a circus show, and so we practiced balancing and like, fine motor balancing, like we made stacks of my child's toys before the show, and then we did our own balancing gross motor on one foot, and then we saw the show, and the feedback was that it was like you already have these embodied experiences when you watch circus. But then it was kind of heightened. And then the program, it was kind of cut short. Our last event was supposed to be a jazz concert, and we had a chef come in to show us to do improvised cooking beforehand, so we could do improvised cooking and then improvised music. But we pandemicized. So the project is like a little nebulous in the air, and I didn't want to continue it on the internet because to me it was important that the people came out in the place. So now I have to re-administrate and figure out how the budgets and fiscal years and stuff work. But I will assemble the group again in this idea of community.
Yeah.
And hopefully continue the program and find new ways.
Thank you very much for adding that, because one of the things I forgot to say in my introduction is that one of the themes that goes through my interaction with the four of you is your generosity. You are four people who are incredibly generous, at least to me anyway. And that runs through your work, and there is a care aspect that is in all of your work, as well as I did acknowledge that Ruairí had actually been developing investigation into aftercare. But now, as we're a little over time, I'm going to turn it over to Robin to see if there's a question. And if you want to turn your videos back on, attendees, like half of you are very close friends of mine, so it might be a bit weird to call you attendees, but maybe I'll call you attendees.
Thanks, Lois. Liz, I'm wondering if you feel that your question maybe was answered, and or if there's anything you'd like to elaborate on. For
Sure. Sure. First of all, I loved what everyone shared. I'm so glad I came. Thank you for making this event available to everyone. Thank you for that. My question was for Louise. So as a French-speaking Newfoundlander, like I don't use English much in my everyday life. I also spent 9 months on the Port-au-Port Peninsula, and I thought it was really interesting, the idea of like residency, and I actually felt like a foreigner in the province. Because mon accent français était différent de leur, and my accent in English was very different from theirs too. So there was this otherness, and I wanted to know how your different, like I want to know if your stay on the Port-au-Port Peninsula changed your view of being a Newfoundlander. Like did your view of the province change, or how did it affect your work? The idea of belonging to a province or different parts of the province, did it affect it at all?
I would say yes, absolutely. I went there in 1994, and up to that point, I didn't realize that like the French, there were French Newfoundlanders. We weren't taught about it in school, very, very little, right? And so, so when I got there, the people were very familiar and yet very, well, exotic for, you know, and I spoke Quebec French, but to hear their French, which has so many different influences in it, and then to hear the music and the stories. They have so many songs there, in particular because of two singers who came over from France, who were not fishermen. They were the mystery people they were former priests who was running from something they don't know. So there's so much music there. So it was, yeah, it's influenced my work infinitely. And it's been 25 years I've been going there. So, and I've done community work there but they really, okay, so here I am. What they really taught me a lot about was taking 2 steps back and thinking about identity and inclusion, and how we all have multiple identities, because the identity they weren't talking about when I was there was their Mi'kmaq heritage. they would refer to, oh, my Indian grandmother sometimes, and they use Mi'kmaq words, but now it's being embraced and explored, and that's really exciting. So they've just taught me so much about listening, respecting, and then also doing that for myself.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. Robin, back to you. Is there anything else that?
No, there's no more questions in the chat right now, but maybe if anybody wants to like signal and verbally ask a question, that could be nice.
Well, I'm going to put one of these crazy ones, but Ruairí, I'm just going to put a timer on for this, just so that we can, you know, you definitely won't finish, but you said I could ask you, what kind of futurity can be found and cultivated in the rural, remote North Atlantic? And you also suggested you might talk about spirituality and the teachings of Karen Barad. I'll give you 1 minute to answer that.
Yeah, I'm reflecting, also digesting everything everyone's shared. And it seems to me that also maybe
2 minutes then.
Just the moment that we're in, thinking about crisis. And I suppose in terms of futurity and crisis, I would propose that perhaps because of our locations on the precipice or on the edge of things, we have a different relationship, or we're forced to have a different relationship or lived experience of crisis. So it was interesting to hear, you know, the blizzard, the opiate epidemic, the pandemic that we're in now, what HIV and AIDS did in our communities. The list goes on and on and on and on. But when you're outside of the urban or the capital or the market or the neoliberal, or you're slightly aside or parallel, trying to work parallel to it, and they are your neighbors, the people that you see on your street, not some faceless person in crisis, then I think the idea of the mehel, or this coming together, or the community way of working, or yeah, just there's something, I think we have a privilege and also a kind of responsibility to witness and to work on. I think the big thing for me that I've been reflecting this year is I got on a plane and went to an island on the other side of the world and showed up at Lois's house, having never met her, at Chris Nelson's recommendation. So on a wing and a prayer, but I think our relationship to the ongoing climate crisis, and also just our way of working and being on and with the land, or with the, I don't want to say nature, because then we make this divide between nature and culture again, but I think we have technologies or practices as dancers and as movers in the world, or as improvisers, whatever they might be, that are key actually to recovery and change. And I think it will be actually on the edges and here on these islands that those changes will be led and will happen from, I think, because it is that generosity and that hosting, that radical form of friendship or community, I think that is the start. It's not the solution, but it's a start. And I think it's a much more healthy place to create from, aesthetically or conceptually, when the theater as a black box maybe is failing us in the same way that the market is failing us, or the pipelines will fail us, or whatever it might be. So that's a rambling answer, but I'm trying to, it's a kitchen table. I'm doing kitchen table answers.
That's pretty good. And I think you were 2.5 minutes for such a huge question.
Queer time.
Good. Can you? Ted, I feel like you look like you have something to say, but do you? No. Okay. Do we have another? Oh, I can't hear you.
No, you said no.
Okay, good. So Robin, do we have anything else? Is there any question? Is there a question that the panelists would like any one of you, do you want to ask, like Candice, do you want to ask Ted a question, or Ted, do you want to ask Ruairí a question, or Louise, do you want to ask?
I just saw maybe Kathy.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I don't know if you can hear me. Okay.
Oh, hi. This is Kathy Ferry. She's the founder of Neighborhood Danceworks, and you should tell us where you are and what time it is, Kathy. And she's one of the 3 people that I mentioned that did the Bogot piece. And if we were any good, we wouldn't be here, a long song of dance. And so she's one of my mentors. Thank you, Kathy. Go ahead.
Love. I'm in Paris. I've been here for a long time. Although I lived on the West Coast in France for a while, after leaving Newfoundland. And my daughter lives in Berlin. She dances. Anyways, I don't know what else to say because there's so much to say after so many years. But these things that really touched me, for instance, what Ruairí said about being on the coast and no longer thinking about periphery and center, which was central to our questioning in Bogot, because here we are, and we kept coming back to the fact that we're in the Atlantic, and that was the center. And everybody else, the question is that everybody else says, as you said, Louise, but why are you going there? There's nothing there. So in the end, it's almost a question of whose gaze you're talking about. Because when you're creating work, there's nobody in New York or in Paris or in Montreal who's going to really consider it essential what you're doing, because to them, it's on the periphery. Now, I don't know what can change that and if it's important, but it's really about how we see ourselves, what we're doing, but also if you're trying to survive. Ted mentioned about getting grants, etc. When you're trying to survive, it's very hard to get an official or an institutional clear look at what you're doing, because they're already colored by where you are. So I don't know, but I think that's an essential thing for survival anyways. That's one of my questions, if you have any ideas.
So does anyone of you 4 wish to comment on? I mean, I'm happy for us to live with a question, but if you have a comment that you'd like to make back, we're fairly close to, we're like 4 minutes away from wrapping up. Thank you, Kathy. It's really, I wasn't sure because you'd mentioned you had audio issues if you would be able to speak. So I'm so delighted that you did. Okay.
Ted.
Okay, Ted.
So I'll just fill in a little bit. Is that I started in Winnipeg, and for 4 years I got $300 in grants over the total 4 years, and did a piece or 3 or 4, sometimes 5 a year. And I produced myself in like art galleries and whatever, and people danced for me for free, all that stuff that we all went through. And then I became artistic director of a company with a $500,000 budget, out of the blue, complete luck, complete whatever. And then I stayed there 6 years and said, I don't like doing this. And then, but that gave me the ground to be able to get grants. But it was all pure fate or something. It wasn't my doing. Anyways, I just thought I'd say that. But I basically, $300 in 4 years, I understand.
Yeah, that reminds me of the time that we got, myself and Ann Troke got a $600 grant to go to 3 communities, and one of them was Halifax. And we didn't go to all 3, and so we had to give the money back. So, Candice, did you have something that you?
Well, I was just, because I had commented on this in our writing too, so I could try to be brief. But as someone who's also not only practicing in Newfoundland, but practicing outside of St. John's, that question just remains about having to like somehow defend the work. And it's hard because I choose to be here, and I choose to be here for artistic reasons. And I can't, like, I've lived in cities, I've worked in cities, and I just don't want to. And for a while, I was getting a lot of feedback on grants nationally and provincially that were saying things like, why aren't you working in St. John's? Why aren't you bringing in some quality work to Corner Brook, like Toronto Dance Theatre or something, like trying to tell me what the practice should be, or tell me to not do the practice, which I was really offended by. Well, at first I was hurt and questioned everything about myself and my life. And then like used to start writing grants a little bit aggressively and saying like, I do this work and I choose to be here and I work with these people for artistic reasons. And then half of my application is not even about the real question. It's just about trying to defend the work. So I kind of stopped doing that, but there's also, and as I sit on juries too, there's kind of an advocacy thing to do. So as you people who are here, I feel like I want to just do the advocacy to you, that when you sit on these juries, that rural work is real work. And it's not because we couldn't make it in the big city, or maybe it is, but it's still real work.
Yeah. Thanks. I think that's just a really great place to end on this. It's real work and it's real play. And it requires a lot of improvisation. So I'm just so delighted. I was very nervous about all of this, and also felt because Ruairí and Louise and Ted and Candice had written so articulately to me over email, I almost felt like, really, I should just gather everybody and say, okay, we're not having it, but I'll send you all an email and you can read it. But this has been a great kitchen table. So thank you, Ruairí, for helping me figure out to call it kitchen table, even though I also called it 10 other or 20 other things. But my sincerest, I'm just grateful to have such incredible, grateful, generous artists in my life who would come and talk to me like this. And know a lot of you that are attending. I know a lot of you very, very well. And I know that we've had a really incredibly generous spirit in this Zoom room. So thank you. And I'll turn it back to you, Robin.
Thank you. I don't think there's anything else. We've got the chat saved. Yeah, if there was any questions that maybe got missed for the panelists, but otherwise, thanks everybody. Thanks, Lois.
Thank you, and keep an eye on on social media or website, because Lori Clark will be leading another session next month with Erwin Churchill.
He's here.
And he's here. I don't know if you want to raise your hand, Winnie. Wait, there he is. Beautiful artist, musician, social activist as well.
And look at these. Aren't these cute?
Yeah, it's my little, anyway, and we're going to have more conversations over the next few months, getting us through the long winter. And I'm really so happy to see all these people in this space together. Thank you so much for coming and staying and sharing, and happy holidays to you all. I miss you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.